Our next keynote speaker is Andrew Grant from Queen's University in Canada. And Andrew is an associate professor in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University and early research award recipient from the Government of Ontario's Ministry of Research and Innovation for his work on security and governance challenges in mineral resource sectors. His latest books are Natural Resource-Based Development in Africa, Panacea or Pandora's Box, and Corporate Social Responsibility and Canada's Role in Africa's Extractive Sectors. His findings, based on fieldwork conducted across Africa and other parts of the globe, have appeared in journals such as International Affairs, International Journal, International Studies Review, International Studies Perspectives, the Journal of Cleaner Production, Extractive Industries and Society, Land Use Policy, and Resources Policy. In 2017, Dr. Grant served as program chair for the International Studies Association annual conference, which brought together more than 6,000 scholars and practitioners in Baltimore, Maryland, here in the US. And now he's going to be talking to us about how just are mineral supply chains in the just energy transition, insights from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And thank you for joining us for this workshop.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the very kind bio and invitation to join you. Also, I thank you to Shelby for sorting out all the logistics, and thanks to you in the audience. Great level of discussion over the last day and a half. Indeed, I'm a political scientist and international relations scholar. I'll be talking to you today about the Democratic Republic of Congo based on field research I conducted 2 years ago. But I've also conducted similar work in mineral resource sectors across the globe over the last 20 years. I don't sit in my office, I go out to the mining sites themselves, and as you know, often remote parts of the globe. I talk to government monitors there, I talk to the mining managers there, I talk to people from the local community, I talk to NGOs, civil society groups who are there in the mining areas and other parts of the country as well. Because Canada is an important power in the mining game, I'm going to actually say a few things about Canada at the beginning. And I like the comment about friendshoring. So for the US, Canada, we're one of the friends in the friendshoring. So I'll talk about that a little bit, and then I'll move into the DRC more explicitly. And then towards the end, I'll speak to more of the international or global governance initiatives that have focused on some of the governance challenges when it comes to critical minerals and the supply chains. And so it's very well organized for me to come after the earlier presentation. We complement each other very well. And even some of the earlier presentations, you'll see I will touch back to some of those discussions. So just 2 years ago, almost exactly, the Prime Minister of Canada had this huge announcement. He came to my university, to Queen's, which is in Kingston, Ontario. It's about a 2-hour drive from Syracuse, New York. He's very happy here to talk about this EV battery project and a little town in the township, a little town just outside of Kingston, maybe a 30-minute drive from Queen's University. You can see all the smiling faces in the background. Lots of students were there, right? Remember our panel yesterday about students getting into the mining engineering sector and the like, and a lot of excitement. And so at the time, they were announcing the building of that battery plant. They were just about to put shovels in the soil. Well, 2 years later, it was completed on time and I think on budget. This image here, so this is our premier, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford. The premier is the equivalent of the governor, right, in a US state. And here, part of his campaign promises about building a road to the Ring of Fire. An important distinction in Canada, the provinces have a lot of political clout over natural resource development. It's set out in the Constitution, and so you have to have a lot of cooperation between the provinces and the federal government, especially in natural resource sectors. Of course, the federal government, they're involved in taxation, promoting economic growth, even environmental policy. That's the purview of the federal government. But in the Canadian context, the provinces have a lot more clout. Premier Doug Ford, he would be the equivalent of a Republican, Conservative Party in Canada. The Prime Minister in the previous slide, the Liberal Party, that's the equivalent of the Democrats. So on almost every issue area, they're diametrically opposed. They do not get along. But when it comes to the green transition, critical minerals, they're on the same page. In that previous image that I showed you, the Prime Minister, the person wasn't in that photo, but one of the provincial ministers, the Minister of Mines, was at that announcement in Kingston. So again, that's quite notable to have someone from the other party at the provincial level there for that big announcement. Now, the thing here, the Ring of Fire, that's just northeast or northwest of Toronto, quite a remote area. So a lot of Canada's critical minerals, Canada has a lot, they're in quite remote areas, environmentally sensitive areas, and there's not a lot of roads. So again, he's talking about jumping right in the tractor. He's gonna help build those roads, right? Big campaign promise. But the point is there's a lot of enthusiasm in Canada, in Ontario, about the economic prosperity of critical minerals. Of course, there's environmental concerns, very ecologically sensitive areas where a lot of the critical minerals are located. There's high levels of engagement that's required with First Nations. So yesterday, there was one of the talks talked about engagement with the US's American tribal groups. Again, you have a similar setup in Canada, but there's much more legal impetus to engage with First Nations. I can talk about that a little bit more during the Q&A. Now, when we talk about critical and green minerals, again, this group here, you know about these first two elements, the upstream and downstream elements. We had a lot of great presentations over the last day and a half, again, really looking at the innovation on all these different elements. I'll draw your attention to the third point, the geopolitics of strategic minerals. It's come up a little bit in the keynote at dinner last night. The role of China came up quite a bit. And again, some of the other presentations have talked about China's dominance. And it's true, China does dominate both upstream and downstream when it comes to critical minerals. Now, when did China start to do this? Very long, far-sighted. About 30 years ago, right? About the mid-1990s, late 1990s. Very steady, almost stealthily. And now you have countries like Canada, like the US, madly trying to catch up to China on both the upstream and downstream elements, okay? This has become quite clear with the Biden administration, and again, talking to folks in the State Department, Department of Defense, very concerned because as you know in this room, all the different spin-offs, right? There's the economic spin-offs and importance of these minerals, but also the military and security spin-off repercussions of these minerals. So again, very key are the geopolitics of strategic minerals. So I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But again, China's dominance of supply chains is key. And of course, China has a huge presence in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, before I move on to that, just a few last points too on the relationship between Canada and the US on the just energy transition. So in the US, of course, you have the Inflation Reduction Act. So I hinted at that just a moment ago. If we look at Canada, since 2022, we've had the Critical Mineral Strategy. And then, of course, the US, the Mineral Security Partnership. So Canada's listed as one of the allies. You have Australia, another ally as well. As part of the friendshoring, but this is key, again, for a political scientist to have these policy pronouncements. This shows that these themes are important and people in government are thinking about the challenges, right? You guys know that from your interactions, from your partnerships. But this is something that the wider public may not always be aware of. But again, governments are thinking about this and how can they catch up to China upstream and downstream in terms of the mineral supply chains. Now, Canada is going to be the president of the Group of Seven, the G7 meetings. And so Italy was the past president. And critical minerals was one of the themes, but it was sort of a little bit lower. Still a lot of focus on Ukraine, other security, or national security, traditional security concerns. But it's expected to be a prominent theme when Canada hosts the G7 in mid-2025. Again, we shall see. U.S. elections are on the horizon. Some of the other commentators have pointed this out. The U.S. is always an important participant at the G7, and we shall see who's holding the presidency in mid-2025. But especially if it is the Democrats, we can expect to see even greater developments around the Mineral Security Partnership, again, for the G7 meetings. So again, this is something that's very key, and the term just energy transition comes up quite a bit, and I'll talk about that in a few moments. Now, I think at least on one of the posters out in the foyer has talked about relevant UN Sustainable Development Goals. So in thinking more internationally, right, it's a global concern. It's just not in the US or in Canada thinking about the just energy transition. You hear this on the lips of people at different diplomatic meetings, at industry meetings, people are talking about the just energy transition. But it's something that the United Nations has been focusing on as well First of all, climate action, that's really straightforward. So SDG number 13, affordable and clean energy. So this speaks to many of the presentations we've seen thus far at the workshop, even earlier today, right? New technologies going through mining tailings or mine waste, right? What is the efficient way to do it? Is it profitable? Is it affordable, right? Thinking also for consumers too. So again, that's part of the just energy transition. Life on land, again, that's quite straightforward as well. But even some of the other presentations talked about the impact that, for instance, tailing ponds and tailing mounds can have on the wider environment. Responsible consumption and production. So yesterday there was a discussion around forms, different conceptions of sustainable development, how that's evolved over the years. Sustainable mining, different phrases and concepts and how they've evolved. And again, this points to number 12, responsible consumption and production, right? That responsibility, thinking about future generations, right? Not saying no more consumption of different minerals, no more uses of cell phones and laptops and the like, but again, it's something that's much more responsible. Employment and economic growth. So again, remember we had the panel yesterday afternoon talking about employment, trying to encourage new workers to focus on this sector, the critical minerals sector in particular. So again, this is something that even within UN SDG circles is quite key and important. The sixth point here. Now, the presentation just before mine, excellent, talked about this, touched on this. And this is something that I'll say a little bit more about in my presentation. The peace, justice, and strong institutions. So when it comes to critical minerals, thinking about the supply chains, often we see this in places where there is insecurity or there might be civil conflict in the region. There might be high levels of government corruption, high levels of grievances because of this, and something that's taken place over decades. It's not just new corruption, it's something that may have gone on for decades and decades. If we think of cases like Papua New Guinea from the 1990s, right? The influence of a mining site on fomenting rebellion. All these elements are quite key. So peace, justice, and strong institutions. This is a key element as well. So I'll talk about this a little bit towards the end of my presentation. But again, this comes up in the context of the DR Congo. And again, when I look through some different global governance initiatives, often they look at the relationship between minerals and violent conflict more broadly. So when we talk about the just energy transition, right, what are those ethical considerations? And again, the presentation just before mine looked at a lot of those elements in great detail. So as you all know, the DRC is very mineral resource rich. All around the country, this is just a very basic map. Of course, even some of the different minerals that are not listed here are present in the country. Some of the minerals, of course, are difficult to access due, again, something like lack of roads. So if we think of lack of roads, that's something that afflicts Canada's north. It's not just countries of the global south. In the east, you have a lot of instability. So when you often hear about anything about the DRC, it's about renewed fighting here, government militias, rebel groups, also the influence of Uganda, especially Rwanda. And then where I conducted my field work, I traveled all across the southern part of the country here. This is the copper belt, so a lot of copper and different minerals that we associate more with the so-called just transition, so cobalt and the like. Now, one important element for any country, but especially for the DRC, its relationship with its neighbors. So in the southern part of the country, where you have your copper and cobalt, thankfully relations with Zambia are pretty good, pretty amiable. Angola, it's been up and down over the years, but nothing too significant. However, in the northeastern part of the country, Uganda, especially Rwanda, have really interfered in the country's affairs for many decades. Rwanda doesn't have much in the way of mineral resources. I think it could use with a little bit more geological survey work, but still not nearly as mineral rich as its neighbor, the DR Congo. So again, if we think of illicit movements of gold and the so-called 3 Ts of the 3 Ts and Gs, a lot of that is in the northeastern part of the country where all this instability is occurring that we hear in media reports. In 2018, I went to the border region. I was in Uganda, very unstable on the Congolese side, so I couldn't go into the DRC, at least in that northeastern corner. But I was interested in reports of different minerals being smuggled across the border. There was these different global governance initiatives in place, these policies that were meant to stem this trade because it was seen as one factor in promoting the violence or financially supporting the violence in the country. And so I went to I was going to one of the trading posts where I wanted to talk to different traders and observe with my own eyes what was going on, what sort of regulations were actually in place. As I was traveling out, just before I got there, I stopped in a small town at night, and I heard, I had a radio, right, an old crank radio, that there was a big shootout between Ugandan police and Congolese military personnel. Now in Uganda, the police are well armed, they're well trained, brand new uniforms, they're well paid. The president, Museveni, he wants to keep the police on side. So you see them rolling through different cities. Again, everything is sparkling. The Ugandan army, it doesn't quite get the same sort of love from the president, the same sort of levels of funding and so on. So in this dispute, it was actually the Ugandan police, a local police detachment with Congolese army personnel. Now, the Congolese army, again, not very well paid or trained, all these sorts of things. Every 6 or 9 months, they have little skirmishes, right? Allegedly, in this case, it was over fishing, right? So the fishermen on the lake here that cuts between the two countries, they were called out to mediate dispute. But really, right, who's involved in these smuggling networks, right? The political economies of these cross-border trade networks often is the police, the army, customs agents, right? Other small-scale entrepreneurs and the like. So that was likely one of the causes of the firefight, not so much over the fishing rights, right? That's small potato. Sometimes they do levy informal taxes on the poor fishermen. So I go the next day thinking, it's all gonna be blocked off. There's no way I'm gonna be able to get close to where I need to go at the border. It was as if nothing had happened, less than 24 hours. Meanwhile, both national capitals are recalling their ambassadors over this. It's huge news. You can see the newspapers here. But what it speaks to, right, is lack of state capacity, right? It was almost as if nothing had happened. So I was able to go conduct my interviews, talk to people about the different cross-border trade networks and the like. It was, again, as if nothing had happened. And under the lake too, by the way, that's where there's oil. So the Congolese government keeps accusing Uganda of stealing that oil, diagonal drilling. So that's one other element. I know we haven't talked much about oil and gas. We're looking more at, of course, solid minerals. But that's another dynamic here, why the two countries have had acrimonious relationships. And again, as I mentioned, Rwanda has also interfered in its domestic affairs. So when we talk about different elements of just energy transition, we're trying to think about governance initiatives or policies that work. It's also important to reflect on what are the relationships with neighboring countries, what happens on the ground. Now moving on, the next set of photos are of mine from the DRC itself. So what I'm talking about are governance gaps. So notice I'm talking about governance. So it's not just government, right? Government's involved. But in 2024, when we talk about these policy challenges, it's not just about the government, right? It's not just the government helping or getting out of the way. It's also industry. It's also civil society groups, local communities, right? So again, governance gaps. So again, issues around human rights and human security, right? That's relatively straightforward. We saw in some of the other presentations as well, child labor and the like. Epistemic communities, I'm going to come back to that, state and non-state actors. So again, who else is involved in these governance arrangements? Increasingly, industry is part of this, whether through industry associations, right, or companies themselves. And of course, what are the non-state actors doing? The miners themselves, entrepreneurs, NGOs, right, civil society groups. Epistemic communities, I just want to take a moment here. So you have all these different policies or negotiations trying to promote fair trade, ethical supply chains. Epistemic communities, that's the expertise, right? So again, many of you in this room, this made me think of this quite explicitly, even when it comes to devising new ways of going through old mine tailings, right? There's technical knowledge there. Same thing if we think about even the actual trade of different minerals, right? Different minerals have different logistics, right? Some are easier to ship or less so, or easier to smuggle or less so. All these elements, you need specialized expertise. So that plays an important element too in governance gaps. You can have great policies, but if you don't know some of the technical, engineering, logistical challenges or characteristics behind these initiatives, they won't work. We've seen this in different cases around the diamond sector and others over the years. So this is a bag of cobalt that was artisanally mined and washed. So again, what we see increasingly, these transnational advocacy networks, it's not just government, right? You have to have other actors involved. And again, some of the other presentations over the last day and a half have talked about that, about this relationship. One thing that hasn't come up, and some of you in the room will be aware of this, the issues around security governance. So on a mining site, what is the level of security? What type of training do security personnel receive? Is it an external security company? Is it in-house security? Do they have lethal armaments or not? All these elements come into play. And of course, on a mining site, there's a lot of valuable things on a mining site. Vehicles, equipment, copper piping, diesel fuel, right? Even you could say, arguably, even some of the parts of the mine concession, quite valuable if there's artisanal mining going on. There's even cases too when employees are traveling to mining sites, it can be dangerous. This happens in South Africa quite a bit, where people traveling to and from mining sites, employees, are shot at or attacked or mugged. So again, this photo of mine is part of a case where trying to include local communities to provide that security. So in a country like the DRC, you have at least 6 levels of security for mining sites. You have the mining police, different levels of the army are involved, the Presidential Guard often has a contingent on mining sites. Then you have private security firms, right? You might even have 2 different private security firms on the same mining concession, maybe an in-house and another. And of course, if you're a local community member, who do you go to see? Or if there's a concern around security, do you know if someone is a security official or not? So in this case, they brought in local community members to provide community security, almost like a community policing initiative. This was one of their outposts. And again, this was in the interest of local procurement, but again, trying to bring in local communities. So again, the previous presentation, how do you promote that engagement with local communities? So in this case, again, an example of trying to promote that form of inclusiveness. Now, again, this might be a one-off, and I'm curious to know if this has really proceeded as well as it had initially from 2 years ago. But again, even on the security governance factor, is something that's extremely important to reflect on. Now, again, the governance challenges. This is just not about government. Another initiative nearby where the large-scale mining companies set aside an old mining concession that had been mined out, an artificial pond had accumulated over the years, to allow artisanal miners from the region to come and wash copper and cobalt here and then sell it. There's little informal markets. So large-scale mining companies are actually still going to buy that production, but it's from sources where it's not efficient for them to mine, right? And that's something we've seen in other presentations. Is it efficient to mine a certain mineral? And so again, it's seen as a way to reach out to local communities in terms of local content, some employment. There's NGOs involved in this, and so companies are donating protective gear. But if you look here, I know it's very faint here, but let me assure you, no one's wearing protective gear. Now, anyone from the audience, why do you think that's the case? They have brand new protective gear, gloves, goggles, boots, hip waders. It's hot. That's one of the reasons. Yeah, it's hot. What else? Why else would it be? Because it's super hot and humid. One other reason why folks wouldn't actually use that, even though it would be very helpful. It makes it harder? It is. It makes it harder to do the washing, right? Because you need to actually have your hands free. You're in the water, right? You need that level of dexterity or tactile elements. And so even though they have dozens and dozens and dozens of brand new protective gear, no one's wearing it. Because again, you can have this great plan. The company, because yes, we donated 400 sets of hip waders and boots, but no one's actually wearing it. Even the civil society group can say, hey, we have all these great programs, but when you don't go on the ground to see what's happening, again, it shows some of these logistical challenges, right? So again, people aren't using that. The water here too, there's rumors that there's levels of radioactivity, again, trace minerals leaching in over many years. There's a Chinese mining, large scale from back here in the distance. So they're complaining to this mining company, and they said, okay, we'll test this water. They came out, took some water samples. Okay, we'll test it. A couple of weeks later, what were the results? Oh, it's fine. The water's fine. The NGO said, well, can we see the results? No, just trust us, right? So again, again, trying to establish that transparency and trust. So this water, again, there's still rumors that it is very toxic, but people, of course, are in there day in and day out. One other governance challenge, too, are issues of sexual exploitation and harassment. So most of the people doing the washing are women, and the men who have the artisanally mined copper and cobalt are men. So one question I had was, well, how do you set this up, right? You have hundreds of people setting it, like how do you get linked up, and how does this actually work? Well, it's informal. It might change from week to week or month to month or even day to day. But then some respondents reported that, you would negotiate a price. Well, I'll wash for today and it'll be X amount, a couple of dollars. Or for a week, maybe, let's say it'll be $50 for the week. Well, often there's and if you want this arrangement, sexual favors, right? So this is something, again, that gets overlooked when we talk about some of the governance challenges. Forms of sexual exploitation. Again, there's very little other forms of employment in the area. And so, again, additional pressures when we talk about human rights and the like. And again, one thing that we've talked about a lot over the last day and a half, the environmental challenges. So those still persist in these cases. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's global governance initiatives. There's big negotiations that have been occurring for years and years. It's not just new. And some of these, again, can be applied to critical minerals. So a lot of the early days were on what are called conflict-prone minerals. So gold in the 3 Ts, diamonds. But again, there's the potential for critical minerals to fall into that category. So this is a couple of photos from Geneva, from the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights. And so in their December meetings last year, what were most people talking about, and mining comes up a lot during these sessions every year, it was the just energy transition. The just energy transition. How can we sort this out? And you have groups from civil society, from government, and industry. Sometimes you even have local community members who will be able to make the trip to Geneva, and they have different panels and meetings and groups, and you have these exchanges. Sometimes they're quite acrimonious exchanges. Sometimes they are more civil, and you have different working groups and different initiatives that come to meet. But the just energy transition was on everyone's lips during these meetings. And same thing at the Mining Indaba in Cape Town earlier this year, and in March in Toronto at the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada meetings, right? It draws 30,000 people every year. A lot of people are talking about the just energy transition. No matter what their actual focus was, they were trying to talk about that concept and figure it out. So again, when we think about these governance challenges for critical minerals, again, can we get to the just energy transition? We can draw on past initiatives. We don't have to start from scratch. Kimberley process and conflict diamonds is more than 20 years old. You may have heard of blood diamonds, right? So again, a lot of progress on nearly eradicating the trade of blood diamonds over the last 2 decades. ICGLR RCM, that was what drew me to the Ugandan side of the border, the DRC, has been full of a lot of loopholes. Again, it was trying to follow on the Kimberley process, but again, even from its shortcomings, we can figure out some ways forward. Voluntary principles on security and human rights. So again, that speaks to more of the security elements that I touched on. But again, even at their meetings, again, a big focus now on critical minerals, the just energy transition. So their recent meetings were in Washington, D.C. Just a couple of months ago. Again, a lot of the discussions and a lot of the panels were talking about the just energy transition and critical minerals. UNGPs on business and human rights, as I mentioned just a few moments ago. Again, now you have all these different ethically sourced supply chains around gold and cobalt. A few people have talked about IRMA. That's a slightly different, but that's in the discussion as well. So what is IRMA doing, and how can it be adapted more explicitly to critical minerals? And then you have the OECD due diligence guidelines. You have the EITI, which was mentioned just earlier this afternoon. And then the European Union has had quite compelling legislation looking at critical minerals and trying to promote ethical supply chains. And so this is something for us to reflect on in terms of the power dynamics, the policies, what happens in practice or on the ground. You can have great plans, great ideas, but how does it actually take place on the ground? And that's why, again, the epistemic communities, those with the natural scientific knowledge, the engineering background, often they can be looked to provide that important information. Sometimes they're based with government, but oftentimes they're based with industry. And so increasingly in all these different initiatives, to differing degrees, you have industry involved. Some are more industry-led, some are less so. But that's an important part of the equation. That's why I speak of governance. Right? It's not just government doing this and that. Right? It's industry, but also civil society and local communities. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.